In 1945, a war ended. Every country involved signed the papers, buried their dead, and moved on. Except one man never got the memo. And he wasn't confused. He wasn't lost. He knew exactly what he was doing. For 29 years, he lived in a jungle most people wouldn't survive for 29 days. He watched newspapers airdropped at his feet. He heard his own family's voices begging him to come home over loudspeakers. And every single time, he came to the same conclusion. It was all a trick, because someone had given him an order, and that someone had never told him to stop. This is the story of the last man who refused to lose a war that was already over. By late 1944, Japan's grip on the Pacific was collapsing. The Philippines had become one of the most contested battlegrounds of the entire war, and American forces were closing in fast. Tokyo knew that a full retreat was coming, but retreat wasn't the plan for every soldier. A small number of Japanese officers were trained not for open combat, but for something quieter: guerrilla warfare, sabotage, intelligence gathering, operating behind enemy lines long after conventional forces had pulled out. One of these men was a young intelligence officer, trained personally by a senior commander before being sent to the island of Lubang. His orders weren't ordinary. He was told that no matter what he heard, no matter what proof was placed in front of him, he was to keep fighting until a superior officer came in person to relieve him of duty. Surrender was not permitted. Retreat was not permitted. Only a direct order, delivered face-to-face, could end his mission. At the time, it sounded like standard wartime discipline. No one imagined it would still matter 30 years later. When Japanese forces on Lubang were overwhelmed and pulled back in early 1945, this officer didn't retreat with them. He and a handful of soldiers melted into the jungle, exactly as trained. Their mission: survive, gather intelligence, and wait. Then came August 1945. Japan surrendered. The war for the rest of the world was over. But deep in the jungle, there was no ceremony, no radio broadcast reaching them clearly, no commanding officer standing in front of him to deliver the words he'd been told to wait for. Leaflets began appearing, dropped from planes, announcing the war's end. He found them, he read them, and he dismissed everyone as enemy propaganda, a trick designed to lure hiding soldiers out into the open where they could be captured or killed. Over the following years, more attempts were made to reach him. Family photographs were dropped into the jungle. Recordings of relatives' voices were played over loudspeakers, pleading with him to come home. Each time, suspicion won. He'd been trained to expect deception at every turn, and every rescue attempt looked to him, exactly like the deception he'd been warned about. One by one, the men who had gone into hiding with him were killed or surrendered. Eventually, he was alone, still patrolling, still rationing supplies, still convinced the war raged on somewhere beyond the tree line. Decades passed. The world outside transformed completely. New governments, new technology, entire generations born into peacetime, while inside that jungle, time had stopped in 1944. It wasn't a government official who finally reached him. It was a college dropout turned adventurer, a young man who'd set out with a simple, almost absurd goal: find the last Japanese holdout still hiding in the Philippines. Against enormous odds, he actually did it. Face to face in the jungle, the traveler told him the war had ended nearly 3 decades earlier. The soldier still didn't move, not because he didn't believe the young man standing in front of him, but because of the order. His instructions had been explicit. Only a superior officer in person could relieve him. A stranger's word, however sincere, wasn't enough to undo 30 years of discipline. So the traveler did something remarkable. He went back to Japan and tracked down the officer who had given the original command all those years before, now an old man himself. He convinced him to travel to Lubang and deliver the order in person. In 1974, standing in the same jungle, the aging former commander finally spoke the words the soldier had been waiting 3 decades to hear. The war was over, and he was ordered to lay down his arms. Only then did he comply. He walked out of the jungle in his tattered uniform, still carrying his sword and his rifle, 30 pounds of ammunition, and a mind that had never once stopped believing he was at war. He formally surrendered his weapon not to the Philippine Army, but ceremonially. Soldier to commander, exactly as his training demanded. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. He became an international headline overnight, a living relic of a war the world had almost forgotten. In Japan, he was treated less like a curiosity and more like a symbol, proof of unbreakable loyalty, discipline pushed to a place almost no one could imagine surviving. But there was a darker side to the return. During those 29 years, he and his men had killed people they believed were enemy combatants or informants, people who, in reality, were simply local farmers and residents living their lives during peacetime. The Philippine government initially considered prosecuting him for those deaths. In the end, he was pardoned, but the weight of what those years had actually cost never fully disappeared from the story. His return forced an uncomfortable question into the open: how many others might still be out there, following orders no one had ever formally canceled? In the years that followed, a small number of additional holdouts were discovered scattered across the Pacific, each with their own version of the same impossible situation. For Japan, his story became something bigger than one man's survival. It sparked national conversations about duty, obedience, and the cost of loyalty taken to its absolute limit. He struggled to adjust to the modern world he'd missed entirely, eventually relocating to Brazil to run a cattle ranch before later returning to Japan to teach survival skills to young people, passing on discipline, if not blind obedience. His story remains one of history's strangest case studies in how a single order, if left unanswered, can outlive the war it was written for. But he wasn't the only man history left behind on an island no one remembered to check. Somewhere in the Pacific, another crew was found. No note, no struggle, no explanation for how every single one of them ended up dead where they stood. That's the story we're telling next, and it might be even harder to explain than this one.